David Tafuri is a former U.S. Department of State official and former UN official. Welcome to our program, Mr. Tafuri.
Thanks for having me. I'm really glad to be here in studio with you.
I would like to begin with your expectations for the year of 2025. There are lots of developments. Ukraine continues to fight back despite all the odds. Meanwhile, Vladimir Putin has suffered numerous setbacks in the recent months: withdrawal from Syria, also high casualties rate, failure to also liberate the Kursk region, and also the Russian economy is in a free fall right now. At the same time, Donald Trump has been elected as the next US president. What is your expectations regarding the war in Ukraine for this year of 2025?
Well, you're right. There are some good signs and setbacks for Putin and for Russia. The biggest thing that's going to happen this month in the United States is that President Trump will be inaugurated for a second term as president on January 20th. And he has talked about what he wants to do with respect to the war in Ukraine. And he said he wants it to end as soon as possible, and he wants to try to broker a deal. So I think we have to take him at his face that he is going to attempt to negotiate a resolution between Zelensky and Putin. But I also think it's going to be very difficult to get past the obstacles. And notably, Zelensky and Putin are very far apart in what they're willing to do, at least what they've said they're willing to do, to have a deal. So look for Trump to try to make that deal. If he doesn't get it quickly, then he's going to have to make some decisions about the U.S. approach to Ukraine. One of those questions is he going to continue the weapons and military aid to Ukraine? That's obviously crucial to the people here in Ukraine, and most importantly, crucial to the soldiers that are fighting on the front line on behalf of Ukraine, but really on behalf of the West against the aggression by Russia. President Trump will also have to decide very early on if he is going to continue the sanctions. And I would say that the sanctions, if we really want them to work, we have to not only keep the ones that we have in place, we have to add to them. Because while you said that Russia's economy is hurting, it's not hurting enough to slow down and stop the Russian war machine. Russia still has sufficient revenues, especially from its sale of oil, to manufacture more drones, more military equipment, and more weapons that are killing Ukrainians every day, as you know.
I would like also to pay your attention to the first question you just mentioned about security assistance. Would it be a real thing for Donald Trump to negotiate a ceasefire if he stops sending military aid for Ukraine?
Well, I think the premise of your question is a good one, which is that how can you negotiate a deal with Putin if you take the pressure off of him first? And hopefully President Trump and his senior advisors that are going to be coming into the White House with him recognize that actually to get a deal, they might have to ratchet up the support for Ukraine. They might have to ratchet up the sanctions, as I talked about in the last answer, do some more things on sanctions to really hurt Russia, to force Putin to the table.
From your perspective, what kind of leverage Donald Trump has over Russia in terms of Ukraine? And do you feel that he would be ready to use all tools which are on his table, which would be on his table in the White House?
I think he comes in with a lot of leverage to begin with, because I think Putin really wants some decisions from Trump that will be positive for Russia. He very much wants that sanctions relief. He also would like to see Trump ease off the weapons support to Ukraine. So he's going to try to appease President Trump. But if that leverage that Trump has doesn't work, President Trump is either going to have to increase the leverage or he's going to have to compromise. And hopefully he's not going to compromise in a way that hurts the long-term security, viability, and sovereignty of Ukraine.
How do you see the possible scenarios after the January 20th regarding Trump and these negotiations between the United States and Russia? And can you imagine a scenario in which Trump meets with Vladimir Putin in the United States, for example?
I can very much imagine a scenario where President Trump meets with Putin. Remember, he met with Putin, I think, 3 times, one-on-one, during his first presidency. And a couple of those meetings had a significant time where they were together just in private with 1 or 2 translators, no aides. And so that was how they formed this better relationship, supposedly, according to each of them. But whether President Trump is able to accomplish anything from those one-on-one meetings remains to be seen. Putin is a very cagey person. He's not always honest, even with people he considers friends, even when he can be easily shown to be not telling the truth. He also breaks deals all the time. So this is going to be a complicated, difficult negotiation between Trump and Putin. But I do think that they will meet in person. I'm not sure, though, that they will meet in person in the United States. I think Putin would be worried about going to the United States, as he is worried about going to any Western country around the world. Remember, he's indicted by the ICC. Now, the United States is not a member of the ICC convention, but the United States could choose to arrest him. I don't think that that would happen under President Trump, at least not initially. But I think there's too many dangers and too many questions around a visit by Putin to the United States. I don't think he would do it. Remember, he's not traveling very much. I think he's been to Belarus, he's been to China, he's been to a couple other places, but he's very worried about travel because he carries with him that baggage of being indicted by the ICC, accused as a war criminal, and believed to be a war criminal by people around the world, including especially in Europe.
Can Donald Trump be played by Vladimir Putin during one-on-one meetings, from your perspective?
Well, I would certainly hope not. And remember, President Trump, he may do some of those meetings one-on-one, but he has his advisors to prep him and prepare him and to bounce ideas off with, to report back on what he heard from Putin. I don't know what will happen in those discussions. I want to be optimistic. I want to take our incoming president at face value, that he does intend to find a compromise that's going to be good for both countries and be good for the world. But I do think anyone going into a negotiation with a former KGB officer, someone who's used to getting his way, someone who uses violence and uses corruption to get his way when he doesn't get it immediately, should be very wary of any discussions with Putin, should be question anything that he says, should look for backup for anything he says, and look for assurances that he's going to do what he says.
Also, there are lots of discussions regarding Kit Kellogg's plan on the war, on ending the war in Ukraine by creating a demilitarized zone across these front lines, by also imposing a ceasefire and enforcing this ceasefire with the European peacekeeping forces. What is your take on such plan, and do you believe that Kremlin can agree with such conditions?
I think this plan would be a good one if it could actually be implemented. I'm just not sure if it can be implemented for 2 reasons. First, I'm not sure where you would get these peacekeeping troops for. I don't see European countries, volunteering to send their young men and women into harm's way on the border with Russia, which again cannot be trusted, which is engaged in war crimes inside Ukraine and could easily engage in violence against peacekeeping troops. I also question whether Russia would actually observe any ceasefire, whether they would actually just break the ceasefire very early on after the ceasefire were entered into. And so these are some of the reasons why I'm not sure this plan will work, but in theory, it's a good one.
Is there a potential for a confrontation between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin in case if Putin declines, like the best case offer, Trump's offer on Ukraine?
He hasn't said much, President Trump, to suggest that he wants to, engage in any sort of confrontation militarily between the United States and Russia, but he is also unpredictable. And so if he ends up being very disappointed by Putin, if he feels like Putin has lied to him or has harmed him or harmed his presidency, you could imagine that's possible. But we haven't heard any communications from President Trump or his advisors to suggest that they are leaning that way.
Let's cover also North Korean involvement in the war in Ukraine. According to President Zelensky, 3,800 North Koreans have already been killed or wounded in the war against Ukraine. Why did Biden's administration fail to deter deployment of North Korean troops to Ukraine and Russia?
Well, this is an astounding development. It happened very quickly. We heard that, 10,000 or more North Korean troops had showed up in Russia, that they were being sent to the front line in the Kursk region, and now many have been killed and slaughtered. And there are reports that suggest that Russia hasn't been careful about protecting the lives of these North Korean soldiers. And I'd also note that these North Korean soldiers are not battle tested. Many of them are probably not well trained. We don't know about the interoperability between North Korean troops and Russian troops. I think there are big questions there about whether they are even working together well. They've basically been slaughtered. And Kim Jong-un, the leader of North Korea, probably doesn't care, because he doesn't care much about the welfare of his people. His country is destitute. It's impoverished. There's a political oppression in North Korea. So perhaps there aren't many repercussions for a dictator like Kim Jong-un when he sends his people to be killed for no reason, for no valid reason in Russia. But I think it's a concern because it shows that some countries, rogue states like North Korea, are willing to support Russia no matter what, that they want that alliance so badly. They're willing to sacrifice the lives of so many young people from their country. Hopefully that's not going to happen with more of the other countries that are friendly with Russia. But I would note, Russia doesn't have that many friends in the world. You're talking about North Korea, Belarus, Iran, used to be Syria. That's not their friend anymore. They're being kicked out of Syria. Just a few countries that actually support Russia no matter what. Let's hope that alliance does not grow. And that's one of the things that the incoming president and NATO have an obligation to prevent, is to prevent there from being stronger alliances for Russia so it can rely on more countries as it continues this illegal war here in Ukraine.
Let's also sum up President Biden's legacy on Ukraine. What, from your perspective, what are the biggest successes and failures of the President Biden's decisions on Ukraine?
Well, I think people will remember that President Biden and the Biden administration were very clear from the beginning of the invasion, even before the invasion, that if Russia invaded Ukraine, it would be illegal and the United States would oppose it, and the United States with NATO would defend Ukraine. And so I think he deserves accolades for his very certain stance on that position and for following up. As soon as the invasion happened in February of 2022, the United States began providing support. It actually began providing support, of course, before that, giving training, giving weapons. And so I think Biden and the Biden administration deserve credit for the very firm stance they took against Russia and for the substantial support that they've given. And remember, no other country has given as much as the United States has to Ukraine in this time of crisis. But I'll also say that given where we are now, almost 3 years after the invasion, and the fact that Ukraine is still bogged down in a violent war that is destroying the country and killing so many innocent people here in Ukraine, that people may question why the Biden administration did not do more, especially 6 months into the war, a year into the war, a year and a half into the war, when it was clear that for Ukraine to win, it needed more weapons. It needed restrictions on its use of weapons to be lifted. It needed the delivery of weapons to happen faster. It needed sophisticated weapons systems like the Patriot missiles that they have now but didn't have at the beginning. And they need more of them. We don't have enough Patriot missile systems here. We need more of all of this weapons and equipment, and people will probably question why Biden didn't provide it more quickly and a greater quantity of it, so that when Russia was particularly weak in the first few months after the invasion, Ukraine wasn't able to make more gains.
Do you feel that Biden administration was too cautious in providing Ukraine with security assistance?
I think when we look back on it, that will be one of the questions we have to think about. It's hard to say because we don't know everything that the Biden administration has done. We don't know the behind-the-scenes discussions between President Biden and Zelensky and their teams. But I think there are good questions about whether he's been too cautious. And I would say even right now, we are expecting President Biden to put in place a new sanctions package against Russia that would target Russia's oil sector, including secondary sanctions on the companies that help Russia sell oil around the world and that provide the revenue that Russia is using to build more weapons to kill people in Ukraine. And I would say, wonder, is Biden being too cautious by not issuing those sanctions before he leaves office? We have very little time now. It's still expected, but I don't know if it's going to happen. My guess is there are discussions internally in the Biden administration, and there must be some advisors who are cautioning Biden against doing it.
Let's cover also sanctions against the Russian economy. How can you sum up and to reflect on the results, on the success or failure of these sanctions against Russia, which have been imposed by the Biden administration?
Like the military aid and the financial aid, the sanctions that the Biden administration put in place at first, right after the invasion, were good and were effective. And the sanctions program did harm Russia's economy. And so again, the Biden administration deserves credit for that. But now, almost 3 years later, you have to wonder whether we've done enough in terms of the economic punishment against Russia, because as time goes by, countries like Russia learn how to evade sanctions. They put in place new systems to make payments, avoiding the international banking system, avoiding U.S. banks. They set up new companies that can engage in oil sales and engage in transfers of component parts to support the Russian war machine. And so you have to question, have we augmented sanctions enough as time has gone by to ensure that we're closing these loopholes as they're created by Russia and by those who want to support Russia? And have we done enough to harm Russia's source of revenues, which is mainly oil, the sale of oil and petroleum products? We put in place a price cap on the sale of oil, and that was negotiated by the United States with the other G7 countries. And that also, I think, worked at first, but now you have to question, is it working enough? Should the price cap have been changed? Should the price have been lowered? Because Russia is selling for under the market price for oil, but it's selling at a high enough price that it is making a profit. And it is using that profit to kill people here in Ukraine and to propel and support the illegal war here in Ukraine.
Do you think that President Biden regrets being too cautious in supporting Ukraine and imposing sanctions against Russia?
I don't know what he thinks, and I think time will tell. I think after he's no longer president, he'll probably give some interviews, maybe write a book, and we'll get better insight into what he's thinking. I would note that he has a lot of things to worry about, right? Russia is a nuclear power. And so while he wants to support Ukraine, he also has to be cautious about not starting a nuclear war. And so those are some of the things that go into the calculus. We don't know all of the facts and the way that they calculate these things, but I do think there will be questions about whether he was too cautious. And I'd like to hear answers from him and his top aides as to why they did some of the things they did and why they didn't do some of the things, namely providing more weapons, lifting the restrictions on use of weapons, and putting more harsh sanctions, especially on the sale of Russian oil.
What kind of sanctions Trump administration can impose on Russia to force Putin to negotiation table, from your perspective?
If President Trump and the Trump administration, when they come into office on January 20th, want to cripple Russia's economy, they will put in place secondary sanctions on the shipping companies and other companies that act as middlemen that aid Russia in selling its oil. They will also work harder to convince some of the countries that are our friends, like India, to not buy Russian oil or to buy Russian oil at a much lower price. So Russia is barely making a profit, and they'll use coercive tactics and use incentives to get countries like India not to buy so much Russian oil. That is where sanctions could be more effective, is in hitting Russia where it gets its revenues from, and where it's and it utilizes those revenues to support manufacturing of weapons and to support the purchase of component parts from around the world. So that's what the Trump administration needs to target if they really want to hurt Russia's economy.
President Zelensky, in his interview with American podcaster Lex Friedman, said that we can use 300 billion of Russia's frozen assets to fund US military support for Ukraine. And also, Zelensky suggested that Trump could do this with such money. What is your take on such idea to use frozen assets to fund US military aid for Ukraine?
I'm really glad you brought this up because I agree with President Zelensky about this. Right after the invasion started in February 2022, European countries and the United States froze Russian central bank assets that were invested around the world, but mainly in Europe, a little bit in the United States. Reportedly, that's at least $300 billion in assets that are frozen, so Russia cannot access them, but they're actually owned by the Central Bank of Russia. Over the last couple of years, the United States and Europe have worked to change some laws to make it possible for them to confiscate these central bank assets. And even a couple months ago, the United States and European countries agreed to use those assets as collateral to give loans to Ukraine. So we've already opened the door to accessing those assets and utilizing those assets to support Ukraine. And so I think that President Zelensky is right, that if the United States under President Trump wants to withdraw all aid or halt all aid, which last year was around 62 billion dollars in aid to Ukraine, you could easily replace that by utilizing the $300 billion in central bank funds. You can imagine that you could actually replace all of the U.S. aid per year over the next 4 years with that $300 billion. And what's also really nice about using that money is while it, in one way it helps Ukraine, it also, on the other side of the coin, harms Russia, because Russia then has to watch its own money decreasing in its bank accounts around the world where it's frozen, and Russia has to recognize it's never going to get that money back. So it's highly coercive to Russia as well, and we can use it as an incentive to force Putin to the negotiating table. And if he doesn't negotiate a fair deal, then you could just keep taking that money and he can watch it decline to zero.
You just mentioned about many instruments of Donald Trump, which Donald Trump has to force Putin to negotiation table. Do you believe that Donald Trump really now has enough power to force Vladimir Putin to appropriate a ceasefire deal with Ukraine if he wants?
I think any U.S. president, whether it's President Biden or President Trump, has enough power to force Putin to the negotiating table. Again, the United States has the biggest economy and the biggest military in the world. And with our partners in the NATO countries and other Western countries around the world together, Putin can't stand up to us if we're unified in our support for Ukraine. We have much bigger economies, much bigger militaries, much better weapons. So any president, Biden now, Trump in the future, does have the capacity, if they want, to force Putin to the negotiating table and to give Ukraine what it needs to win the war, which again would ultimately force Putin to back down or go to the negotiating table.
Does this mean that Vladimir Putin's fate depends fully on the decision of the next US president?
I think that's a lot of pressure to put on the president because there are other factors. Obviously, it also depends on what the European countries are going to do. Remember, the European countries together, if they wanted, could easily replace the aid and assistance the United States is providing. They have big enough economies, they have enough money, large enough budgets, and large enough military stocks to, for at least for a couple years, replace what the U.S. is providing if Trump decided to cut off all future military assistance to Ukraine. So it depends a lot on the European countries. And just as a reminder to everyone, the United States is much stronger when it has the support of its closest allies in Europe and in other countries around the world, like Japan, Australia. I don't want to leave them out. They're not part of NATO, but they're also very important allies who should also be helping the United States and NATO with its support for Ukraine.
Thank you, Mr. Tafuri, for your time and for doing this interview here in Lviv, and glory to Ukraine.